The smell reaches you before anything else, rosemary crushed underfoot, sharp and green against the cool stone of a path, no longer anywhere on any map. It is sometime in the 12th century. The sky above a walled garden in southern England has not yet fully decided to become morning, and a woman named Edith is already kneeling in the dirt, her fingers moving through the herbs the way a reader moves through familiar sentences, without looking, without thinking, only knowing. She has been doing this since before the birds. She will do it long after you and I are names that no one remembers. Settle in now, pull the blanket a little closer, because this story deserves your full stillness, and it is going to take you somewhere very far from here, to a world where medicine was not yet separated from the earth it grew in, where healing was not yet a building you drove to, but a garden you walked into before dawn, barefoot if you had to, fingers already reaching. Edith's garden is not large. It occupies the corner of a monastery grounds where the wall catches the sun longest, and every plant within it has a purpose that Edith could recite in her sleep. Lavender for the nervous humours, yarrow for bleeding that will not stop on its own, feverfew for the headache that arrives with light, wormwood for the stomach's darker complaints, each one planted with the kind of deliberate faith that we no longer quite have language for, a faith that said, the earth already contains what the body needs, and the work of the healer is simply to listen carefully enough to find it. This was the logic of medieval medicine, and it was not foolishness. It was a system, intricate, earnest, deeply human, built across centuries by people who watched, who tested, who failed, and tried again, and who wrote everything down in the flickering certainty of candlelight, in rooms that smelled of ink and winter, and something herbal they had been boiling since dawn. We will smile at some of what they believed. We should. But we would be wrong to laugh without first pausing to notice what they had gotten right. What they had, in some cases, gotten exactly right, centuries before the instruments existed that could explain why. Edith does not know that. She does not need to. She pinches a sprig of rosemary between her fingers, holds it briefly to her nose, the way some people hold a letter they have read 100 times, and then places it in the basket beside her knee, with the careful economy of someone who has never once wasted a thing. Somewhere beyond the garden wall, a patient is already waiting. There is a fire being built. There is water being set to warm. She will be ready before it comes to boil, long before anyone looked through a microscope and saw the small, bright riot of life that lives inside a single drop of blood. The most educated physicians in the world believed with complete and untroubled confidence that the human body was governed by 4 invisible rivers. They called them hummers: blood, flame, yellow bile, black bile. And they believed that every illness, every fever, every sadness, every burst of inexplicable rage was simply a matter of one river running too fast or another running too slow. It is a beautiful idea, in the way that wrong things sometimes are, clean and symmetrical, the kind of explanation that satisfies something deep in the human need for order. The system had not been invented in the Middle Ages. It had been inherited from Hippocrates, from Galen, from a tradition so old and so revered that questioning it would have felt less like skepticism and more like standing in a cathedral and doubting the walls, and so no one questioned it. Not really, not for a very long time. A physician named Geoffrey, practicing in the cathedral city of Canterbury sometime in the 1180s, would have assessed his patients the way a gardener assesses soil, with experience with the senses, and with an inherited map that told him exactly what he was looking for. A man with too much yellow bile would be irritable, hot-tempered, prone to fevers, the colour in his face carrying a faint golden tint that Geoffrey had learned to read the way a sailor reads weather. The cure was to cool him, to balance him, to bring the rivers back to their proper depth. Geoffrey would have prescribed a particular diet, rest, Perhaps a preparation of cucumber and violet, cool herbs for a hot condition. He would have done all of this with genuine care, with real competence, with the steady confidence of a man who has helped many people and intends to help many more. He was, in most of what he understood, completely mistaken, and he never knew there is something quietly devastating about that. Not a sharp grief, but a slow one. The kind that arrives when you realize how much of what any of us believes with certainty is simply the cathedral we were born inside. Its walls so familiar we have mistaken them for sky. The four humours would govern Western medicine for over 1,000 years. Scholars would defend them. Universities would teach them. Brilliant people would build elaborate and genuinely impressive intellectual structures on top of a foundation that was, beneath all the sophistication, wrong. And yet, within that wrong system, certain things were noticed, certain patterns were recorded, certain remedies were recommended, not because anyone understood why they worked, but because they had been seen to work, and something true was being preserved, unknowingly, inside the error. The error was the shell. The truth was still alive inside it. On a clear night in the winter of 1263, a surgeon named Brother Anselm stood at the narrow window of his cell and looked up at the moon with the focused attention of a man consulting a colleague. He was not being mystical. He was not being mystical. He was not being superstitious. At least not in the way we mean the word now. He was doing what every trained medical mind of his era did, as naturally as checking the weather. He was reading the sky for information that would tell him whether tomorrow was a safe day to open a body. The moon, in the medical understanding of the 13th century, was not decoration, it was instruction. The logic ran something like this. The moon governed moisture. Everyone could see that. It pulled the tides, it swelled rivers, it made certain plants grow faster in its full light and slower in its absence. The human body, which was largely fluid, was therefore subject to the same influence. A full moon meant the body's humours were at their highest and most agitated, the blood running closer to the surface, the risk of dangerous bleeding elevated. A waning moon meant the body was calmer, drawing inward, more receptive to the controlled violence of a surgical blade. Brother Anselm had seen enough men survive and enough men die on his table to have developed strong opinions about timing. Take one slow breath. We are about to go somewhere very far away, into the cool marble logic of a world that looked at the same sky we look at and drew from it a medicine so internally consistent, so carefully reasoned, that dismissing it requires us to first understand it, and understanding it requires us to sit with the strange and humbling fact that Brother Anselm was, in at least one measurable way, not entirely wrong. Modern research into circadian biology and lunar cycles has produced results that continue to surprise. A study of cardiac surgeries found statistically different outcomes at different points in the lunar month, not for mystical reasons, but for reasons involving the body's own internal rhythms, its clotting behavior, its inflammatory responses, its deeply ancient relationship with light and dark, and the slow pull of celestial bodies it has been calibrating against for 100,000 years. The mechanism Brother Anselm described was wrong. The observation beneath it may not have been. He did not know this. He knew only what he had recorded in the margins of his surgical notes in a hand that was careful and small, that the patients he operated on during a waning moon seemed, on balance, to fare better. He attributed it to the grace of correct timing. He thanked God for the clarity of the sky. He pulled his robe a little tighter against the cold of the window, noted the moon's position in a small wax tablet, and went to bed. Tomorrow, he had decided, would be a good day to cut. There is a particular kind of pain that medieval people knew better than almost any other. It arrived without warning, settled into the jaw like a hot stone, and refused, absolutely, to be reasoned with. It did not care about your station in life. It did not care that you were a lord or a labourer. a nun, or a fishmonger. It simply arrived, and then it stayed, and the night became very long indeed. The toothache was one of the great democratizing forces of the medieval world. A woman named Marjorie, living in a market town in Norfolk sometime in the 1240s, would have known this pain. She would have pressed a cloth to her swollen cheek, the way people have always pressed cloth to swollen cheeks, uselessly, desperately, with the small human hope that pressure alone might mean something. And then she would have gone, or sent someone to whoever in the village was known for knowing things. What they offered her would look, to modern eyes, like the contents of a nightmare arranged on a wooden shelf. Cloves, pepper, mouse fat rubbed directly onto the aching tooth, a poultice of garlic and salt, in more desperate cases a live worm placed against the gum because it was widely believed, across centuries and geographies, and extreakings in topographies, that toothache was caused by a tiny worm boring through the root, and that drawing it out was the only true cure. Go ahead and adjust your pillow. You are going to want to be comfortable for this part, because it is stranger and more interesting than it first appears. The worm, of course, did not exist, but cloves did. And cloves contain eugenol, a compound so effective at numbing dental pain that it remains an active ingredient in dental preparations to this day, used in the offices of the very profession that replaced the village healer entirely. Marjorie's remedy, arrived at through centuries of trial and passed down through whispered instruction and hand-copied herbals, had found something real, not through theory, not through understanding, but through the long, patient accumulation of what worked. The cobwebs were something else again, applied to wounds to stop bleeding. They were common enough to appear in texts across multiple countries and centuries. Modern research has since found that spider silk contains vitamin K, which plays a direct role in blood clotting, and that the dry environment of a web may have inhibited certain bacterial growth. No medieval healer could have told you any of that. They knew only that cobwebs pressed to a cut seemed to help, and so they pressed them. The mouse fat remains indefensible, but there is something worth sitting with here. The image of Marjorie, cheek pressed to her cloth, pain finally easing, the cloves' warmth spreading slowly through the dark of her jaw like a small and wordless mercy. She did not know why it worked. She only knew that it did. She was born in 1098 into a world that had very precise ideas about what a woman was permitted to know, and she spent the next 81 years quietly, systematically, knowing everything. Hildegard of Bingen was a Benedictine abbess, a composer of extraordinary music, a visionary who described her revelations in language so vivid it still unsettles readers 9 centuries later. She was also, and perhaps most remarkably for our purposes, a medical writer of genuine and lasting consequence. A woman who sat in a stone room in the Rhineland Valley and compiled, from her own observation and the accumulated herbal wisdom of her community, a body of work that mapped the physical world with the patience and precision of someone who believed that understanding creation was itself a form of devotion. Her great medical text, Causae et Cura, was not a work of mysticism dressed as medicine. It was, by the standards of its time, a serious and careful attempt to understand how the human body worked, what disturbed it, and what might be offered to restore it. She wrote about the properties of plants with the specificity of someone who had used them, not merely read about them. She wrote about lavender as a treatment for head complaints, about fennel as an aid to digestion, about the particular properties of spelt, which she considered one of the finest grains a sick person could eat. Easy on the stomach, warming without overheating, gentle in the way that good medicine should always be gentle. Modern nutritional analysis of spelt has found it easier to digest than common wheat, with a different gluten structure and a higher concentration of certain nutrients. Hildegard did not have the language for any of that. She had something older, the accumulated observation of a community of women who had been cooking, healing, and paying close attention for longer than any of them could remember. She wrote that lavender, inhaled or applied, could calm a troubled mind. Aromatherapy researchers have since identified compounds in lavender that measurably reduce cortisol. She recommended willow bark for pain and fever. Willow bark contains salicin, the compound from which aspirin would eventually be synthesized 600 years after her death. She did not know she was right. She knew only that she had looked and listened and written down what she found with the same meticulous devotion she brought to her music and her prayers, as though truth, in whatever form it appeared, deserved to be received with full attention. What she wanted, more than recognition, was simply to be useful, to have the knowledge she carried pass through her and into the hands of whoever needed it next. It is the quietest kind of ambition, so ordinary in its goodness, but it aches. She picked up her quill in the cold of the scriptorium, and she kept writing. The candle burned low, and she did not stop. This was not unusual. This was, in fact, so standard a part of surgical practice in the medieval world that certain texts included the recommended prayers alongside the recommended instruments, as though the invocation and the blade were equally necessary tools, equally important to have sharp and ready before the work began. A surgeon named Thomas, practicing in London sometime in the early 14th century, would have known both his prayers and his knives with the same intimacy, the same daily familiarity of a craftsman with his trade. Surgery in this period occupies a strange place in our imagination. We picture it as pure horror, the screaming, the filth, the absence of anything we would recognize as hygiene or anesthesia. And we are not entirely wrong to picture it that way, but we are wrong to picture only that, because within the chaos and the pain and the very real danger of the medieval operating table, something genuinely skilled was sometimes happening, performed by hands that had trained for years and minds that had studied longer than most modern medical degrees require. Thomas would have learned his craft through apprenticeship, watching before touching, touching before cutting, cutting only when his master judged the eye sure and the hand steady enough. He would have known his anatomy imperfectly, incompletely, often incorrectly, but genuinely. He would have known how to remove a bladder stone through an incision in the perineum, a procedure so delicate and so dangerous that it carried a mortality rate that would horrify any modern surgeon, and yet was performed with enough success to be attempted at all, which means it worked often enough to be worth the risk. He would have known how to set a fracture, how to drain an abscess, how to pack a wound with the particular combination of wine and honey that his tradition prescribed. And here, without knowing why, he would have been doing something measurably correct. Wine's alcohol content killed certain bacteria. Honey's low water activity and hydrogen peroxide content created an environment deeply hostile to infection. The wound packed with wine and honey by a 14th century London surgeon had, in at least one important respect, a better chance than a wound packed with nothing at all. Thomas washed his hands before surgery, not because he understood germ theory, which would not exist for another 5 centuries, but because his training told him that cleanliness before the body was opened was a matter of respect for the patient, for God, for the seriousness of what was about to happen. The reason was wrong, the action was right. He stood over his patient in the grey morning light of a room that smelled of tallow and vinegar, his prayer finished, his knife ready, his face arranged into the particular expression of focused calm that every good surgeon in every century has had to learn. He had done this before. He would do it again. The figure appears at the end of the street, and everyone who sees it stops moving. It is not quite human in its proportions. The long dark coat reaching to the ankles, the wide-brimmed hat pulled low, the gloves, the stick held at a careful distance from any surface it does not need to touch, and the face. The face is the thing that children dreamed about afterward, sometimes for years. A long curved beak, like something borrowed from a very large and very serious bird, protruding from a mask of waxed leather that left no skin exposed. Protruding from a mask of waxed leather. No breath unfiltered, no part of the human being beneath it visible to the dying world outside. The plague doctor had arrived, which meant the plague had arrived first. It is sometime in the 14th century in a city that still has most of its population, though not for much longer. The beak, which looks like theatre and functions like armour, is filled with something. Dried roses, lavender, mint, camphor, cloves, sometimes vinegar-soaked sponge. A carefully assembled bouquet of aromatics packed into the hollow cavity, so that every breath the doctor drew came filtered through a cloud of fragrance. The miasma theory of disease held that illness travelled through bad air, corrupt and invisible, rising from rot and filth and the exhalations of the already sick. The beak was designed to replace that bad air with good air before it reached the lungs. The theory was wrong. The mechanism was wrong. The beak did not work in the way its designers believed it worked. And yet, bubonic plague is transmitted primarily through the bite of infected fleas, but pneumonic plague, the form that colonized the lungs and traveled on breath, is airborne. A sealed mask of waxed leather packed tightly with aromatic herbs and a vinegar-soaked sponge would have created, not by design but by accident, something functioning in the approximate vicinity of a rudimentary filter, not an effective one, not one that would satisfy any modern standard of protection. But the plague doctors who wore them did, in at least some recorded cases, survive contact with patients at rates that puzzled the people who came after them and tried to understand why. They thought the roses were saving them in a way that they could not have articulated and would not have believed if told. They were perhaps not entirely mistaken. There is a particular sadness in this that is hard to name precisely. The figure in the beak, walking toward the sick, was doing the bravest thing imaginable, entering the most dangerous room in the world, armed with the wrong explanation for a correct instinct, caring for the dying with a tenderness that the costume made. Miserable, beneath the leather, beneath the beak, beneath the roses, there was a person in there breathing carefully, trying not to die, trying very hard to help. The roses smelled at least of something living. There is a particular quality of silence that exists only in very old stone buildings in the middle of the night, and the monks who lived inside it knew it better than anyone. It was not an empty silence. It was an inhabited one, full of the small sounds of a community breathing in unison, of candles settling, of someone in the scriptorium still working by the last of the light, copying something that needed to be copied before morning came and the day's obligations swallowed the quiet whole. It is in this silence that so much of what we know about medieval medicine was preserved. The monastery was not merely a place of prayer. It was, in the most practical and unglamorous sense, a functioning institution. A farm, a hospital, a school, a kitchen, a library, all contained within the same set of walls, all operating simultaneously, all dependent on the same community of people who had committed their lives to the idea that work and worship were not opposites, but expressions of the same devotion. The herb garden was as sacred as the chapel, the kitchen was as important as the scriptorium, and the infirmarian, the monk assigned to the care of the sick, occupied a role so central to the life of the community that his knowledge was considered worth writing down, preserving, passing forward into futures he would never see. Brother Edmund of a small Benedictine house in Worcestershire, working sometime around 1190, kept a record of his remedies in a manuscript that smelled permanently of the kitchen and the garden both. His handwriting was not beautiful. It was the handwriting of a practical man, someone more interested in being useful than in being elegant, and recorded without ceremony the treatments he had found to work. the ones he had found wanting, and the careful adjustments he had made over years of watching people get better and better again. His recipe for a preparation of garlic, honey and thyme for chest complaints has a directness that reads almost modern. Garlic contains allicin, which has demonstrated antimicrobial properties in laboratory conditions. Thyme contains thymol, an antiseptic compound still used in commercial mouthwashes. Honey, as we have already seen, creates an environment hostile to bacterial growth and has been used in modern wound care with genuine clinical success. Brother Edmund did not know any of this. He knew that the preparation helped. He had seen it help winter after winter in the cold stone infirmary where the sick lay on narrow beds and the fire was never quite warm enough, and his job was simply to do what he could with what the earth had provided. He wrote it down so that whoever came after him would not have to learn it again from nothing. That manuscript, or something descended from it, may still exist somewhere, in an archive, in a collection, patient and still and smelling faintly, even now of time. Some knowledge refuses to be lost. Not every story in this garden ends with the patient rising from the bed. There is a temptation rising from the bed. There is a temptation. When we discover that medieval healers were sometimes accidentally right, to let the warmth of that discovery spread too far, to let it colour everything there, to allow the romance of the herb garden and the candlelit scriptorium to soften what was also genuinely true. And what was also genuinely true is this. People died on tables they did not need to be on, from treatments that made the original illness look merciful by comparison, administered by healers who believed completely, who prayed sincerely, who never once doubted that they were hell. Ping, the bloodletting needle, is where we must begin. Phlebotomy, the deliberate opening of a vein to release what was considered excess or corrupted blood, was not a fringe practice. It was the single most commonly performed medical procedure in the medieval world, recommended for fevers, for headaches, for melancholy, for swelling, for infections, for conditions we would now treat with rest and fluids and time. It was performed on the sick and on the healthy, preventatively seasonally, the way some people now take vitamins in winter. A physician named Richard, practicing in Oxford in the 1290s, might have bled the same patient 4 times in a single month and considered himself thorough rather than dangerous. The human body contains, in an average adult, somewhere between 4 and 6 litres of blood. It can lose a meaningful portion of that volume before the body's compensatory mechanisms begin to fail. The heart rate climbing, the blood pressure dropping, the consciousness narrowing to a small bright point before going out entirely. A patient already weakened by fever who was then bled repeatedly was not being balanced, they were being emptied. King Charles II of England, taken ill in 1685, was subjected to a treatment protocol so aggressively comprehensive that historians have since described it as a near-perfect record of everything medical practice had gotten wrong. He was bled, he was purged, he was given enemas. Antimony was administered, which is a poison. He was given preparations containing human skull, which was considered medicinally potent and was, in fact, inert at best and harmful at worst. He died after 4 days of treatment that would, without any intervention at all, have almost certainly given him longer. His physicians wept. They had done everything they knew to do, and they had done it with devotion. This is the chapter that asks us to sit with something uncomfortable, not contempt for the people who caused harm they intended as help, but a quieter, more unsettling question about certainty, about the cathedral walls we mistake for sky, about what we ourselves believe with complete confidence today that someone, someday, will look back on with the same slow grief we feel now. The healers were sincere. Sincerity, it turns out, is not the same thing as safety, and the patients trusted them entirely, which is perhaps the most heartbreaking detail of all. Not the specific garden, not Edith's walled corner of monastery grounds where the rosemary grew thick against the southern stone, not Hildegard's Rhineland valley where the lavender stood in rows that nobody living has ever seen. Those gardens are gone, absorbed back into the earth that made them. Their walls collapsed or repurposed, their paths overgrown so long ago that even the overgrowth has aged into something else entirely. But the knowledge that grew in them, the patient, accumulated, handed forward knowledge of what the earth contains and what the body needs, that has survived in ways that are only now being fully understood. It survived in manuscripts, in the margins of monastery records, in the household books of women whose names were never considered important enough to preserve alongside their recipes. It survived in the oral traditions of communities that had no access to writing and therefore memorized everything, passing it forward in the way that truly necessary knowledge is always passed forward, quietly, personally, from one pair of hands to the next. And it survived, most remarkably, in the plants themselves, which never needed anyone's permission to keep growing. In the last several decades, ethnobotanists, scientists who study the relationship between human cultures and the plant world, have been moving through the historical raw chord with the focused attention of people who suspect they are looking for something real. What they have found has surprised even the most cautious among them. Compound after compound, identified in plants that medieval healers recommended for specific conditions, has demonstrated in laboratory and clinical settings precisely the activity those healers described: antimicrobial, anti-inflammatory, analgesic, anxiolytic. Not all of them, not most of them, but enough of them to suggest that the people kneeling in the dirt before dawn were doing something more than guessing. They were observing, they were recording, they were building, they were building, they were building, they were building, 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 building. They were observing, they were recording, they were building, they were building, they were building, building, they were building, building, they were building, they were building, they were building, they were building, across centuries and without any of the tools we consider essential to the enterprise, a database of human experience so vast and so carefully maintained that it has outlasted every civilization that contributed to it. Brother Edmund's thyme, Hildegard's lavender, Marjorie's cloves pressed against the aching jaw in the dark of a Norfolk night. Edith's fingers moving through the herbs before the birds had decided on morning. All of it part of the same long, slow, patient conversation between human beings and the world they found themselves living in. A conversation that did not begin with the first written record and has not ended with the last. We are still in it. We are still learning what they knew. The scientists working in laboratories today, isolating compounds from plants that grow in monastery gardens, are in direct and unbroken conversation with the women who planted them 900 years ago. They have simply found, at last, the language to explain what those women already understood. The earth knew. It was always going to wait. It had, after all, nowhere else to be.